Generally speaking, when you take a course on the Middle Ages or you read a survey text about the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages between 500 and 1000 CE tend to be glossed over to a large extent. Partly this is due to the evidence simply not being anywhere nearly as abundant as the evidence for things like antiquity or the Middle Ages after 1000. But in large part it's due to a prejudice against this period as being more unknowable, one, but also less interesting, and being a time when things didn't really change or happen at the same rate that they happen in other periods of history. So what I'm going to basically do in this lecture is look at this idea of the Dark Ages, and we're going to examine whether or not this idea has merit. We'll look at the pros and cons of that approach. And we'll talk about the debates about the nature of the early Middle Ages. And in subsequent lectures, what I'm going to do is look at various examples of the post-Roman West so we can see the varying fates of different kingdoms and peoples in the region during this period. Let's quickly consider what the Dark Ages narrative actually is. So the general idea here is that the early Middle Ages, the years 500 to 1000, were a period shrouded in darkness. And that's more or less what a Dark Age is. It's a period where we don't have any literary sources to illuminate what's going on. So in the absence of this literary evidence, we can't really know all that much about a period. And if a society is not producing that kind of evidence, then it's a pretty good sign that the society is deeply in decline, deeply impoverished, disorganized, chaotic. So because of that, we look at a society in the early Middle Ages and we see poverty, disease, illiteracy, a lack of what we call high culture. And we also see Roman traditions withering on the vine in the West. And these things are only preserved in Byzantium and the Islamic world, where the standard of living and the degree of governmental efficiency and education is high enough to sustain such things. For the most part, if we look at the basis of the Dark Ages narrative, it's based upon people looking at what was going on in France and Britain, where we don't really know a lot of details, especially in Britain. And not surprisingly, because Britain was a place that was enshrouded in mystery in the early Middle Ages, Edward Gibbon, when he's writing his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 1760s, 1770s, he looks back and he sees a vibrant Rome which was suddenly overthrown by a bunch of barbarians from beyond the frontier who were aided by the lack of focus from a lot of Christian subjects in the Roman Empire, and that they allowed barbarism to triumph and destroy all that was good and glorious about Rome. The Dark Ages narrative also, even though the Dark Ages also can imply things like ignorance and poverty and all of that, the term Middle Ages also contains some negative connotation in the sense that it means a time between two things. And usually if you say something is intermediate, it implies that it's merely transitionary and that it doesn't really have all that much merit in its own right. So the idea of a Middle Age is that it's just there to facilitate the transition between the two things that matter, i.e. antiquity and then early modernity on each end. So this is basically what the Dark Ages narrative is and sort of the assumptions which underlie it. But now let's look at its absolute opposite to see what the earliest alternative that scholars came up with was. So one of the main things that any academic historian or archaeologist has to do is to come up with different ways to look at old material in order to contribute something new to their field. And starting in the 60s and 70s, this was known as revisionist history, where you interpret things in a different way to make people think differently. You look at different aspects of existing topics to shed new light. Stuff like that. Well, in the 90s and early 2000s, one thing that emerged was a transformation narrative which, for a while, totally displaced the Dark Ages narrative. And this transformation narrative is basically that the years 500 to 1000 were actually a gentle period of transition from the Roman rule to the various successor states, and that there was no decline in that typical sense that Edward Gibbon used the term. Because, in a way, decline really just implies that you're passing a moral judgment as a scholar, and you're not really being objective or trying to view things in the way that the people at the time would have viewed stuff. Now, there actually are some people who, rather than just saying we can't say decline because it isn't politically correct or because it isn't in line with the thinking of people at the time, there are actually scholars who say that life was materially better for most average people in the early Middle Ages than it had been in late antiquity. And one of those scholars is the archaeologist Peter S. Wells, who comes up with several examples of towns in places like Germany and even parts of France where the standard of living is demonstrably better after the fall of the Roman Empire. And a lot of this is due to there being less large-scale warfare. He also looks at the lack of evidence for huge battles and says, well, this is a sign of progress in a way because we're not seeing the kind of large-scale destruction. Without this big governmental apparatus in Rome, you can't generate these kinds of destructive wars that really disrupt people's lives. And there also is no state apparatus there to collect taxes or put burdens on people. So whereas a Dark Ages narrative person would see that evidence and say, well, there's infrastructure that looks like it's falling apart, someone like Peter Wells would say, that's because the people there are able to keep their money and use it on themselves, and they can enjoy their lives rather than trying to maintain the glory of an empire that was long gone. And the people who look at this transformation narrative, the people who really try to say that there was no material decline, a lot of them draw their evidence from Byzantium, where the Roman Empire had not fallen. And we'll look at Byzantium later, but they certainly thought of themselves as being 100% Roman. And also Italy during the early Middle Ages was almost unaffected in a lot of parts by the fall of the Roman Empire. Prosperity and society continued as if nothing had ever happened, really. So that's a very different way of viewing the evidence, but it's also, in many ways, as I pointed out, with the difference between looking at Byzantium and Italy versus England and France, you're also looking at different evidence, and that's a lot of why you're drawing a different conclusion. So let's say you're a historian and you don't really have a particular horse in this race, but you want to try to understand this period. Is the label Dark Ages appropriate, or was this period one of a peaceful transition? The problem is, as we said earlier, the term Dark Ages was originally applied to this period because it has very few texts which really illuminate what was going on. So we can't really rely upon the literature to tell us what people's lives were like. So that leaves us turning to archaeology. And there's a built-in problem with archaeology. When you find things like skeletons and farmsteads and old buildings, coins, these things don't interpret themselves. People have to interpret them in a context, which means there's always a degree of ambiguity and a need for interpretation with any archaeological evidence. A lot of people tend to read the evidence as fitting into a preconceived narrative, and while other people will try to come up with a completely new narrative based on this evidence and give it more privilege and importance than literary evidence if the two clash. So there are different ways to approach this evidence, and that really determines the conclusion that you come to. And based on what we can see from the archaeology, assuming that we just kind of look at it dispassionately to some extent, there's not really a strong case to be made for either narrative. We see that there are some pockets, like the ones that Peter S. Wells likes to outline, where there was a heightened prosperity for people living in certain villages and certain towns. Some of these places did grow, and we can tell from the skeletons of the people there that people got larger and were presumably more healthy during this period. However, for the most part, if we look at Western Europe as a whole, we see that most areas seem to be poorer. The population as a whole tends to go down some, especially the cities. And we also see that the average height of a lot of people declined, and that's a pretty good indicator of a nutritional decline. That's usually the number one indicator of nutrition, is average height. So we also see that for the most part, infrastructure is decaying. They're certainly not building new aqueducts or new roads for the most part, but we do see that most of this infrastructure that exists is still in use, and that there is maintenance being performed here and there as these various successor states are capable of doing it. And we'll also look at a couple of examples of times when some of these successor powers were actually able to build new infrastructure, although these are not very common. We also see that the trade volume across the Mediterranean and the surviving overland routes of Europe declined pretty heavily during this period. I believe the number is 40%, if I'm not mistaken. However, the trade routes and the kinds of items on those trade routes remained largely the same. So it's not a qualitative difference necessarily. Perhaps it seems to be a quantitative difference. This was basically just a recession of sorts, if that makes sense. Things got slower and there were fewer people around, but people were mostly kind of doing the same stuff, just on a smaller scale. So now that we've looked at these two narratives and we've looked at how the archaeology has to be interpreted and how it doesn't really solve the issue, my closest thing to a solution is to look at the various successor states of the Roman Empire and try to get a gauge for how well they did materially, and then see which ones kind of match up with which narrative, or if some of them justify both narratives and seem to have a historical trajectory all their own. Now, what we do see, the common threads here, are that all of these Western successor states will try to emulate the forms of the Roman government. So they'll all try to maintain the governmental functions that Rome provided to varying degrees of success. And that means that Roman offices like dukes and comes, which translate in English as duke and count, that's where those words and ideas came from. They were actually ancient originally, and then they became medieval. These things continue, but they become hereditary. And we see that there are varying degrees of decentralization, or what we in the modern world are more fond of calling privatization, of governmental functions during the Middle Ages. And that's one of the other major differences between Rome and its successors. Rather than having a strong central government providing for things like military contingents and tax collection, which then goes to a central authority, a lot of things are simply handled on a local level with very little interaction or correspondence with other areas. And the people who were lucky enough to get a title like dux from an emperor or a king could then go on to hold that title generation after generation, and then make it their birthright over time and make themselves into what we think of as a medieval aristocracy. Now, the success of each kingdom in maintaining its Romanness varied pretty wildly, and those things, to the best of my ability to examine them, really vary depending on luck. What did your neighbors do? What was the weather like? Things like that. Location. The further south you are, the better off you are, generally speaking, in a pre-modern context where you are heavily dependent on good weather to grow crops and whatnot. And stability. Was your kingdom racked by constant invasions or civil wars, or were you able to establish, say, a strong central monarchy and stave off a lot of the worst of civil conflicts? And to me, that seems like the best way to approach this topic of whether there was or was not a Dark Ages. I think that this label does apply to some areas, but doesn't really apply at all to others, while kind of applying a little bit to some others. And in the transformation narrative, it also has some merits to it. There is a transformation in this period. However, it's not peaceful, and I think that there's really not a strong reason to believe that it actually led to some sort of widespread peasant prosperity that they all just spent on perishable items, and that's why we have no material record of it. That's arguing from an absence of evidence, which is a logical fallacy and frankly ridiculous. So that's sort of my take on this, and in my next several videos I'm just going to be looking at the various successor kingdoms of the West, and I hope that I've provided you with enough sort of general background now that you can make your own determination about this whole Dark Ages versus Transformation narrative debate.